The summer sun was shining brightly in London, and the streets near Buckingham Palace were alive with the sound of footsteps, carriages, and the chatter of eager tourists. Among the many groups that had come to see the capital's most famous sights was a small cluster of friends who had traveled all the way from different parts of the world. They had been waiting for this trip for months, saving money, planning every stop and making long lists of photos they wanted to take. Their excitement was high, and the energy in their voices showed how thrilled they were to be in the heart of one of the most historic cities in Europe. The group's leader was a young man named Ethan, who loved recording everything on his camera. He believed that every moment of the trip needed to be captured, no matter how small. His friend Mia was equally enthusiastic, but she was more interested in selfies and funny videos than in learning about history. Two others, David and Claire, were a little quieter, but followed along with cheerful smiles, happy to be part of the adventure. As they walked through the bustling streets, the group passed shops selling souvenirs, little cafes with warm pastries, and tour guides holding up bright flags to gather their groups. The air carried a mix of roasted coffee and the distant sound of a marching band practicing somewhere in the city. Their destination was clear. They wanted to see the royal guards at Buckingham Palace. They had read about them in travel books, watched short clips on social media, and laughed at stories of how the guards never smile or react no matter what tourists do around them. To them, it all seemed like a challenge, like some kind of game to make the guards move or speak. What they didn't understand was that these guards were not simply performers in a show. They were trained soldiers serving in an important ceremonial role, standing watch as a proud symbol of discipline and tradition. But in their youthful excitement, the tourists didn't think too deeply about it. They only thought about how entertaining it would be to get close to the guards and their magnificent horses. The walk to the palace was long, but filled with sights that kept their spirits high. They passed St. James's Park, where swans floated gracefully on the lake, and children fed ducks while parents took pictures. Horse-drawn carriages rattled by, carrying visitors dressed in fancy clothes who wanted to experience London in an old-fashioned way. As the group approached the palace area, the sound of hoofbeats echoed on the paved road. Mia gasped and pointed excitedly when she saw the first royal guard on horseback. The soldier sat upright, wearing a shining helmet with a flowing plume, his red uniform pressed perfectly, and his white gloves resting firmly on the reins. The horse was tall and strong, its black coat shining in the sunlight, its movements calm yet commanding. Around the guard, signs clearly warned visitors, "Do not touch the horses. Keep a safe distance." But for Ethan and Mia, the warning was something to laugh about. "Look, it's just a horse," Ethan whispered with a grin. "Imagine if I get a video standing next to it. My followers would love it." Mia agreed, giggling as she held up her phone. "And imagine if one of us makes the guard move or speak. That would go viral." Claire looked uneasy and said softly, "Maybe we shouldn't get too close. They look serious, and the horses are big." David nodded in agreement, adding, "These are real soldiers, not actors. Let's just watch." But Ethan and Mia brushed off their concerns, treating the warnings like part of the entertainment. The closer they got, the larger the horses seemed. Their powerful bodies stood still, yet their eyes flickered with alertness, ears twitching at every sound. The guards themselves looked like statues, their faces expressionless and focused. Tourists gathered in a semicircle, some taking respectful pictures from a distance, others whispering in awe at the discipline and elegance of the scene. The group of friends pushed their way to the front, eager to get the perfect shot. Ethan raised his camera high while Mia stretched her arm for a selfie. They laughed louder than everyone else, drawing annoyed glances from the other visitors. Still, they continued, unaware of how their behavior stood out. One child in the crowd pointed to the guard's horse and whispered to his mother, "The horse is so big, Mommy." The mother nodded, holding her son's hand tightly, and reminded him, "We must stay behind the line. It's for our safety." The child nodded seriously, understanding the rule, but the group of friends, especially Ethan and Mia, ignored that same line painted on the ground. Slowly, step by step, they moved closer until they were almost within reach of the horse's long face. The animal shifted slightly, exhaling loudly, its breath visible in the cool air. The sound was sharp, but Ethan only grinned wider. "Did you see that? It knows I'm here," he said, as if he had accomplished something special. Claire tugged on his sleeve nervously. "Ethan, stop. You're too close." but he brushed her off and crouched down to angle his camera better. The horse shifted again, lifting one hoof as if unsettled. Its muscles rippled under its sleek coat, and its large eyes blinked slowly, a sign that it was alert. Mia waved her hand near the horse's nose and whispered, "Hey, look at me. I want a photo with you." Her laughter rang out in the quiet space, and more tourists began to turn their heads, whispering disapprovingly. Some shook their heads, muttering words like disrespectful and foolish. Phones began to rise, recording the scene. The guard remained still, his eyes fixed ahead, but there was a clear tension in his posture. His grip on the reins tightened, his shoulders squared. Everyone nearby could feel the seriousness of the moment, except for the two friends who continued to act as if it were a comedy show. David shifted uncomfortably, stepping back and whispering, "They're going to get into trouble." "This is not right," Claire agreed, her voice almost trembling. "I told you. Let's leave before something happens." But the laughter of Ethan and Mia drowned out their warnings. The palace courtyard, usually filled with respectful admiration, now carried an uneasy atmosphere. Tourists who had come to enjoy the tradition now felt secondhand embarrassment and fear for what might happen. The horses, proud and disciplined, were not toys to be teased. The guards, silent but alert, were not props for entertainment. Yet in their excitement and lack of respect, the foolish tourists failed to see that their game was about to cross a dangerous line. And in that moment, as the sun glared off the guard's polished helmet and the horse snorted with growing unease, the stage was set for something they would soon regret deeply. The air in front of Buckingham Palace grew tense as the group of tourists kept edging closer to the guard's horse. Ethan adjusted his camera strap and smirked at Mia, who stood just inches away from the animal. The horse, tall and powerful, twitched its ears and shifted slightly, letting out a deep breath that startled a few children nearby. Yet instead of stepping back, Ethan chuckled as if the horse's reaction was nothing more than part of his fun video. He leaned toward Mia and whispered, "If I can touch the reins, this will be the best clip of our trip." Mia widened her eyes in excitement. "Do it! Everyone will go crazy when we post this." She raised her phone, already recording. Her bright laughter echoed against the stone walls of the palace courtyard, sounding out of place in the respectful silence around them. Other visitors frowned, muttering under their breaths. A father shook his head, pulling his little daughter closer. A few people lifted their phones too, not to cheer the tourists on, but to capture evidence of their foolishness. Claire's heart pounded as she watched Ethan stretch his hand toward the horse. "Please stop," she begged quietly. "This isn't safe. Look at the sign right there. Do not touch the horses. You're crossing the line." David agreed, his arms folded tightly across his chest. "They're soldiers. They're not here for our games." Listen to Claire. But their voices were drowned out by the laughter of their friends. The horse, sensing the unfamiliar movement near its reins, jerked its head slightly and stomped one hoof. The sound of iron against the pavement cracked through the air like a warning. Gasps rose from the crowd, and even some of the other tourists backed away. Ethan froze for a moment, startled by the sudden force, but when Mia giggled again, his pride took over. "Relax, it's just a horse," he muttered, forcing a grin. He stepped back in, brushing his fingers along the leather strap of the reins. In that instant, the guard broke his silence. His voice, deep and commanding, rang out across the courtyard. "Stand back from the king's horse." The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Everyone turned their heads toward the soldier, their eyes widening in surprise. The guard had spoken, a rare event that immediately showed the seriousness of the situation. The crowd murmured with shock. Some whispered, "He actually said something," while others muttered, "They went too far." Children stared up at their parents, asking why the guard looked so serious. Parents explained in hushed tones that the guards were highly trained and must not be disrespected. But instead of taking the warning seriously, Ethan chuckled nervously and pulled his hand back only a little. "Wow," he spoke. "Did you get that on video?" he asked Mia, who was still recording. She nodded eagerly, her smile wide.
"Yes, this is gold,"
she whispered. She spun around, showing her phone to Claire and David as if it were an achievement. "No one else could make the guard talk like this." Claire looked horrified. "That's not something to be proud of. You're making a fool of yourself. Everyone's watching." Indeed, the crowd was no longer amused. People frowned, shaking their heads in disappointment. Some tourists crossed their arms while others held up their phones, now filming Ethan and Mia instead of the palace guards. Their disapproval filled the air like a heavy cloud. The guard's horse shifted again, raising its head high and letting out a sharp snort. Its powerful muscles tensed beneath its glossy coat, ready to move if threatened. The guard tightened the reins skillfully, his posture steady, his face calm but alert. He was ready to control the situation, but the horse's reaction made it clear. It was not pleased with the tourists' behavior. Still, Ethan and Mia did not take the hint. Embarrassed by the guard's public warning, Ethan's pride pushed him further. He waved his hand in front of the horse's face, laughing. "Look, he doesn't like me. Isn't this hilarious?" Mia giggled louder, encouraging him. "Do it again!" But the reaction from the crowd was far from supportive. Gasps and sharp voices rose. An older woman shook her head in disgust. "This is disgraceful. Show some respect." A man with a camera muttered angrily, "They're going to cause an accident." Others whispered about how dangerous the horses could be if provoked. Then suddenly the horse jerked sideways, stamping its front hooves against the pavement with a loud, echoing crack. The force startled Ethan so much that he stumbled backward, nearly colliding with another tourist. The camera hanging from his neck swung wildly and almost slipped from his hands. The crowd let out a collective gasp. A child nearby began to cry, frightened by the sudden movement. His mother pulled him close and whispered soothingly, all while glaring at the foolish tourists. The guard, maintaining strict discipline, did not flinch. His voice rang out once more, louder and firmer than before. "Stand back immediately." The power in his tone silenced even the laughter of Ethan and Mia for a moment. His presence, his authority, and the sight of the horse's strength finally began to pierce through their arrogance. Yet, even then, instead of apologizing, Ethan forced a laugh. "It's just a little spook. No big deal," he said, his face red with embarrassment but his pride refusing to admit fault. Mia, trying to lighten the mood, raised her phone again and said, "Smile, Ethan, this will still make a funny story." David's patience broke. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Enough. You're making everyone uncomfortable. You're not funny. You're reckless. Stop this now before you get into real trouble." Claire nodded quickly, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, let's go. Look at the people around us. They're filming. This is going to follow us forever." But Ethan, stubborn as ever, ignored them. The embarrassment of being corrected in front of a crowd made him feel defensive. He turned back to the horse with a mocking grin and lifted his hat, waving it in front of the animal's face. "Come on, give me a reaction," he muttered. That was the final straw. The horse jerked back, its muscles tightening, and it let out a loud, sharp sound through its nostrils. The movement was so sudden and powerful that several people in the crowd flinched. A few stepped back in fear, while others raised their phones higher, recording every second. The tension in the courtyard reached its peak. The guards remained controlled, their discipline unshaken, but the tourists' foolishness had crossed a dangerous boundary. The crowd, once filled with admiration for the palace's traditions, was now heavy with disapproval and unease. People shook their heads, whispering about the disrespect they had just witnessed. Some even muttered that the tourists would regret their behavior before long. And though Ethan and Mia still wore stubborn smiles, deep down, a small flicker of doubt had begun to grow. The horse's powerful stomp, the guard's commanding voice, and the cold stares of the crowd hinted that the game they thought was harmless was about to bring consequences they never expected. The laughter began to fade, replaced by nervous glances at one another. The fun they thought they were having was slowly turning into a moment that would be remembered not for jokes or entertainment, but for shame and regret. The moment the horse stomped its hoof and snorted loudly, the sound echoed across the courtyard like a drumbeat. The crowd gasped in unison, and a hush fell over the space as all eyes turned toward Ethan and Mia. The cheerful excitement that had filled the air only minutes earlier was now replaced with a thick, uncomfortable silence. Even the birds circling above seemed to pause, their wings cutting through the quiet sky as if nature itself sensed the tension. Ethan froze, his hat still raised midair, his grin stiff and uneasy. For the first time, the weight of the situation pressed on him. The horse's eyes glimmered with alertness, its muscles tightening beneath its glossy black coat. Its body leaned back slightly, ready to react again if disturbed. This was not the harmless joke he had imagined. A chill ran down his spine, but pride forced him to remain in place. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was weak, nothing like the confident chuckles he had let out earlier. The royal guard on the horse sat tall and composed, his eyes forward. But there was no mistaking the authority in his presence. His grip on the reins was firm, his voice sharp as he repeated, "Stand back immediately." The words rang louder than before, shaking Ethan's confidence further. Around him, tourists muttered angrily. Phones captured every second. One man muttered to his wife, "They're going to regret this." "You can't disrespect the guards like that." Another voice added, "This will end badly." Mia, who had been filming proudly, now lowered her phone slightly. Her giggles faded, and for the first time she looked nervous. The tension in the air pressed on her too. But instead of stepping back, she whispered, "Maybe we should just get one more clip. Then we'll leave." She forced a shaky smile, trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Claire's patience had snapped long ago. "Enough, this is humiliating," she hissed. "You're not funny, and no one's laughing with you. Look around." She pointed toward the crowd where dozens of disapproving eyes were locked onto them. Ethan glanced sideways. The shame of seeing strangers shake their heads at him burned his pride. Yet instead of admitting fault, he muttered, "They're overreacting. It's just a horse." But as he said it, his hands trembled slightly. His camera strap swung against his chest, tapping softly as if reminding him of the risk he had just taken. Then, with a sudden sharp movement, the horse raised its head high and let out a deep sound through its nostrils. Its hooves scraped against the stone, and Ethan instinctively stumbled backward. His foot slipped on the pavement, and his camera flew from his grip. It hit the ground with a sickening crack, shattering the lens. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone exclaimed, "That's what he gets." Others muttered, "Serves him right." Ethan's face flushed bright red as he bent to pick up the broken camera, his fingers trembling. But before he could fully recover, another mounted guard shifted his horse closer. The second guard's presence was calm but commanding. The horse moved with precision, its hooves striking the ground with a steady rhythm, cutting a path between the foolish tourists and the palace gates. The guards' horses now formed a subtle barrier, making it clear that Ethan and Mia were no longer welcome near the ceremonial space. The soldiers' silence carried more weight than words ever could. Mia stepped back, clutching her phone tightly. The reality of the moment sank in. She whispered nervously, "Ethan, let's go. This isn't funny anymore." But Ethan, his pride wounded, whispered back, "Not yet. If we leave now, everyone will think we lost." His voice was low, shaky, almost desperate. The crowd's reaction grew louder. A man near the front shook his head and muttered, "Foolish kids." A woman added, "They're lucky the guards have patience." Parents covered their children's ears, whispering about respect and discipline. Dozens of phones pointed directly at Ethan and Mia, recording their embarrassment. The weight of being the center of unwanted attention pressed heavily on them. A police officer, dressed in a bright vest, began moving through the crowd. His expression was serious, his pace steady. He had seen enough. The officer's presence added another layer of tension, and whispers rippled through the spectators. "They're in trouble now," someone said softly. "Good. They deserve it," another replied. Claire saw the officer approaching and whispered urgently, "See? I told you this would happen. You've gone too far." David, his arms folded tightly, shook his head in disappointment. "You've embarrassed us all," he muttered. His voice was quiet, but the sting of his words struck harder than the crowd's disapproval. The officer finally reached the group. His voice was calm but stern as he said, "Step back from the guards. You're disturbing the ceremony and putting yourselves and others at risk." His tone left no room for argument. He stood with authority, his hand resting on his belt as he blocked their path closer to the guards. Ethan swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. He muttered, "We were just having fun." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Fun does not excuse disrespect," he replied firmly. The horse that had been disturbed earlier shifted once more, lifting one hoof and slamming it back down on the pavement. The sound echoed like thunder, and Ethan flinched, stepping back quickly. The camera hanging around his neck clattered again, its broken lens swinging. He felt the eyes of the crowd piercing into him, their silent judgment heavier than any words. At last, the truth of the situation sank in. His arrogance, his pride, his foolishness, it had all led to this moment of humiliation. He glanced at Mia, whose face was pale now, her phone lowered, no longer recording. Her earlier excitement had melted into nervous shame. She whispered, "Everyone hates us. We should have stopped." Her voice cracked as she spoke, filled with regret. The police officer, still watching them closely, repeated firmly, "Step away now." This time Ethan obeyed. He took several steps back, pulling Mia with him. The crowd exhaled softly, the tension easing slightly as the dangerous closeness ended. Yet the disapproval lingered in their stares and whispers. The damage had been done, but the humiliation was not over. As Ethan moved back, his foot caught on the strap of his broken camera bag. He stumbled awkwardly, nearly falling. Laughter rippled quietly through the crowd, not joyful but mocking. It was the sound of people who had lost patience with his arrogance. His cheeks burned hot, his pride shattered. The guards remained stoic, their discipline unbroken, but their calm silence seemed to speak volumes. Their authority, their control, their unwavering focus, it stood in stark contrast to the foolishness of the tourists. The message was clear without a single word. The royal guards and their horses were not props for entertainment. They were symbols of tradition, discipline, and respect. As Ethan and Mia stood at the edge of the crowd, shame finally began to settle deep inside them. The weight of regret pressed heavy on their shoulders. Their earlier laughter now felt hollow. The broken camera in Ethan's hands was more than a ruined device. It was a symbol of the consequences of his actions. The murmurs of the crowd filled their ears. "They'll never forget this," one person said. "Instant regret," another added. The words stung like sharp blades, cutting through the silence of their thoughts. For the first time since they arrived at the palace, Ethan had nothing to say. He simply lowered his head, his pride stripped away. The incident had unfolded quickly, but its impact would last far longer. The foolishness of a few minutes had turned into a memory they would carry forever. A moment of embarrassment and shame, under the watchful eyes of the guards, the horses, and the countless strangers who had witnessed their mistake. The courtyard in front of Buckingham Palace remained heavy with tension, even after Ethan and Mia stepped back. The sound of the horses' hooves still echoed in everyone's ears, and the sharp voice of the royal guard lingered like a warning that could not be ignored. The crowd had grown larger, with more tourists gathering after hearing the commotion. Everyone wanted to see what had caused such a rare break in the guards' silence. Phones were still pointed toward the foolish tourists, capturing their every movement. Ethan stood stiffly, clutching his broken camera. The shame burned across his face, but he tried to mask it with a forced smile. Mia looked pale, her lips pressed tightly together as if she no longer had the energy to pretend it was all part of a joke. Claire and David stood nearby, their expressions showing nothing but disappointment. Their earlier warnings had been ignored, and now the entire group was caught in the storm of humiliation. The police officer who had stepped forward did not relax his watch. His firm gaze remained fixed on Ethan and Mia. He spoke again, calm but stern, so that everyone in the crowd could hear. "This area is not a playground. The guards are here to perform their duty. You have disrespected the rules, disturbed the ceremony, and endangered yourselves." His words carried weight, not only because of his authority, but because they were backed by the silent agreement of everyone watching. Ethan opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but the officer raised his hand slightly, stopping him. "No excuses," he said firmly. "You saw the signs. You heard the warnings, and yet you chose to ignore them." The officer then turned to the crowd and gestured for people to step back, clearing space so the guards and horses could continue undisturbed. The tourists obeyed, but their eyes never left Ethan and Mia. Their stares were sharp, filled with judgment. A second officer joined the first, speaking quietly into a small radio clipped to his vest. The seriousness of their actions was becoming more obvious by the second. The guards remained disciplined, their eyes fixed ahead, their horses standing tall and controlled once again. Yet the calm presence of the guards only made the tourists' foolish behavior seem even more childish in comparison. Finally, the first officer spoke again. "You will be fined for disturbing public order and disrespecting ceremonial units. This behavior is not tolerated here." The words hit Ethan and Mia like heavy stones. Fined? The thought had not even crossed their minds. They had expected maybe a warning, perhaps some embarrassment, but not real consequences. Ethan swallowed hard, his pride melting away as reality set in. Mia shifted uncomfortably, her earlier excitement replaced with guilt and fear. The crowd reacted with nods and murmurs of agreement. Some even clapped softly, not in celebration but in approval that justice was being served. A mother whispered to her child, "This is why we follow rules. Respect keeps everyone safe." The child nodded seriously, his wide eyes locked on the officers. As the fine was being written, one of the guards shifted slightly on his horse. With calm precision, he moved forward just enough to stand closer to the scene. His presence was powerful, though he spoke no words. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered toward the foolish tourists, and in that glance was an entire message. This was not a place for games, and traditions as old as the palace itself demanded respect. The tourists who had behaved foolishly felt the weight of that silent judgment more than anything else. Ethan lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His earlier arrogance had dissolved completely. The broken camera hanging from his neck felt heavier with every passing second, a reminder of how quickly pride could turn into regret. The officer handed Ethan a slip of paper and said firmly, "This is your fine. Pay it immediately and let this be a lesson. Next time the consequences could be far worse." Ethan nodded weakly, unable to speak. Mia muttered a soft, "We're sorry," under her breath, though it was barely loud enough for anyone to hear. But the crowd heard something else, the sigh of relief that came when the situation finally seemed to be under control. Some people began to turn back toward the palace gates, ready to watch the guards in silence again. Others, however, kept their cameras up, eager to share what they had just witnessed. Within minutes, the incident spread online. Videos were posted across different platforms, showing Ethan waving his hat, Mia laughing loudly, the guards' sharp command, the horse stomping, and the officers stepping in. Captions appeared like wildfire. Tourists disrespect Royal Guard's horse. Instant karma at Buckingham Palace. Foolish visitors learn a lesson. Back in the courtyard, Ethan and Mia finally began to understand the seriousness of what had happened. They had not only embarrassed themselves in front of hundreds of people, but also on the internet, where thousands more would soon see their actions. Claire and David shook their heads, refusing to defend them anymore. Claire whispered, "I warned you. Over and over again I warned you. And now look." David added, "This isn't just embarrassing, it's shameful." Ethan felt his throat tighten. For the first time, he truly regretted everything. He had wanted a funny video, something to impress people online. Instead, he had become a symbol of disrespect, a warning to others. Mia, who had once laughed the loudest, now kept her phone tucked away in her pocket. She could not bear to look at it, knowing the very device that had recorded their fun was also the reason their humiliation was spreading. The officers stepped back once they were certain the crowd was calm again. One of them gave a final warning. "Respect the guards. Respect the animals. They are not here for your entertainment. Leave the area quietly." The tone was not cruel but firm, the way a teacher might speak to a student who had gone too far. Ethan and Mia nodded quickly, their voices gone. As they slowly walked away, the stares of the crowd followed them like shadows. Parents pointed them out to their children as examples of how not to behave. Travelers whispered in disbelief at how foolish they had been. Some even chuckled softly, not with amusement but with a sense of justice. The guards remained silent, their discipline unshaken, their horses once again calm and steady. The palace courtyard returned to its usual rhythm. The changing of the guards continued. The horses stood tall, and the tourists who respected the tradition watched in admiration. But for Ethan and Mia, the moment was far from over. Every step they took away from the palace felt heavier than the last. Their laughter had turned into silence. Their excitement had turned into shame. And their memory of Buckingham Palace would forever be tied to this lesson in respect. In their hotel room later, they would see the videos online, the comments pouring in from strangers around the world. Words like disgraceful, ignorant, and foolish would echo across their screens. But in the courtyard that day, the lesson had already begun to sink in. Respect was not optional, it was essential. And when ignored, regret was the only thing that remained. The walk back from Buckingham Palace to their hotel was slow and heavy. Ethan and Mia no longer laughed or joked the way they had earlier that morning. Their steps dragged, their eyes stayed low, and the air between them was filled with an uncomfortable silence. The slip of paper with the fine amount crumpled in Ethan's hand as though squeezing it tighter would somehow erase what had happened. But no amount of squeezing could take away the shame or undo the foolishness that had already spread far beyond the courtyard. Claire and David walked beside them, still disappointed. They did not speak much, but their silence carried more weight than words ever could. Every now and then Claire let out a sigh, as if replaying the entire scene in her head, wondering how her friends could have ignored every warning. David shook his head repeatedly, muttering to himself about how embarrassing it all had been. Ethan wanted to defend himself, to say something, but every time he opened his mouth, the memory of the horse stomping, the guard's commanding voice, and the laughter of the crowd filled his mind. His words stuck in his throat. Back at the hotel, the group slumped into their room. The television was on in the lobby downstairs, and news channels were already replaying clips of the incident. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Tourists disrespect Royal Guard's horse. Visitors face fines after disturbing ceremony. Viral video shows foolish behavior at Buckingham Palace. The short clips looped over and over, the guard's sharp warning, the horse stamping, the police officer stepping forward. Each replay felt like another strike to Ethan's pride. When they reached their room, Mia collapsed onto the bed, covering her face with her hands. "I can't believe this," she whispered. "Everyone saw it. Everyone's talking about us." She pulled out her phone hesitantly and opened one of the social media apps. The video was everywhere. Thousands of views already, hundreds of comments pouring in. The words cut like knives. Disrespectful. So embarrassing. Who behaves like this? Some comments even called them selfish and immature. Mia dropped her phone onto the blanket and groaned. "I wish we never came here." Ethan sat in the corner of the room, staring at his broken camera. The cracked lens reflected a distorted image of his face, and it seemed almost symbolic of the mess he had made. He remembered the excitement he'd felt that morning, the confidence that he would capture something funny and entertaining. But now the broken camera felt like a mirror of his regret. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "It was supposed to be a joke. I didn't think it would go this far." Claire stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly. She finally spoke, her voice firm but calm. "You both treated this place like a playground. You ignored every warning, every sign. You embarrassed yourselves, and you embarrassed us. People come here to respect tradition, to admire the discipline of the guards, not to watch foolish tourists try to make fun." Her words were not cruel, but they struck deeply. They carried the truth neither Ethan nor Mia could deny. David added quietly, "And you almost got hurt. Did you see how close that horse was to knocking you down? What if a child had been standing behind you? What if you had fallen under its hooves? You didn't just risk embarrassment, you risked real danger." His tone was softer than Claire's, but just as serious. The weight of his words sank into the room like a stone falling into deep water. Mia sat up slowly, her face pale. "I didn't think about that," she admitted. "I just thought it was harmless fun. I didn't realize how serious it really was." Ethan nodded weakly, finally admitting what his pride had hidden for too long. "I know," he whispered. "I was stupid. I didn't listen. I thought it would make me look clever, but I just made myself look foolish." The room fell into silence again, but this time it was not filled with anger or embarrassment. It was filled with reflection. For the first time since the incident, Ethan and Mia truly began to understand the depth of their mistake. The next morning, the group decided to visit the Horse Guards Parade, another site where the mounted guards could be seen. But this time their approach was different. They kept their distance, standing quietly behind the lines painted on the pavement. They did not laugh, did not wave their hands, and did not try to disturb the animals. Instead, they watched in silence, their eyes wide with admiration. The horses stood tall and proud, their coats shining in the morning sun. The guards sat upright, their discipline unshaken, their presence commanding respect.